This is the first lecture for the second portion of the course, and in this lecture we are going to focus on the history of the race concept. In one of the first lectures for this course, we discussed the history of studies of human variation, and now I want us to focus on the specific events and circumstances of English life that influenced this movement or formation of a racial worldview. So we're going to start at the very beginning and focus in on where this idea of race comes from in terms of our American history. Once we get to the end of the lecture, this is the point where we will briefly review the history that we've already discussed in the first lecture of the semester. So where did this term race actually come from? Well, we don't see it used in the English language until about 1520. But it comes from the French word raza, which means group or type of people. As we all know, and what we've previously discussed in the first section of the course, it's human nature to want to describe things. And one of the first things that we describe are the differences that we see between one another. And skin color has always been one of the things that are described because it's something that's really noticeable. The first documented instance that we have of describing the differences in skin color occurs as early as 1350 BC. When the Egyptians classified humans based on skin color. For instance, they were classifying the color red as Egyptians, yellow for people from the east, white for those of the north, and black for those of the south. The Greeks, on the other hand, kind of completely different from Egyptians, really viewed a lot of the differences that they were seeing simply based upon culture. In other words, all non-Greeks were seen as, quote, barbarians. And if they took on the Greek culture, if they accepted the Greek culture, then they were no longer seen as a barbarian. So it really had nothing to do in the Greek culture with skin color, but rather it was a cultural type of connection. I want to begin in the 15th century, kind of with a little bit of history, but during this time, Northern Europeans and peoples of the British Islands had really limited knowledge of the world. A few of them were traveling to the southernmost region of Europe, and most of what Northern Europeans knew was scripturally based knowledge. Southern Europeans were a lot less isolated. In areas what we now call Spain and Portugal, Islamic peoples, Arabs, Egyptians, had migrated from North Africa and settled here as early as the 8th century. So this border of the Mediterranean connected peoples of Western Africa, the Sudan, Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern Africa, and the Iranian Plateau. And even parts of India and China. So there were some really significant differences between people of Northern and Southern Europe. Northern Europeans were a lot more isolated from other regions or people of the continent. Southern Europeans were being introduced to an influx of people from various regions. So they were really getting this kind of concept, this visual concept of skin color differences. Columbus's voyage to the New World was not the first of the westward movement. It's often talked about as though it was the first voyage, but numerous others actually took advantage of doing this and moved into unknown regions as well. In either case, the world before then was seen a lot like this picture. There was truly a lack of rigid, what we would consider a racist hierarchy present during the Greek and Roman era. This idea of a hierarchy didn't really appear until the European Age of Discovery. In the 1500s, you have a lot of different groups of people entering the New World. So you have Spanish, French, and English. They were all encountering each other, but also encountering indigenous people and trying to establish themselves in this new world. By the 1600s, there's already a system of indentured servitude in place. So take a look at this map from 1587, and you can see already that there's this really clear divide between different continents, between different peoples. So we're kind of moving towards this us and them dichotomy that we discussed in the beginning of the semester. In 1607, Jamestown in Virginia is established by English colonists. This was really a rough, harsh community, a really rough area. It was primarily made up of young white Englishmen who traveled to America mainly in hopes of making a fortune. Their plan was to conquer and enslave native people, and they probably most likely thought that they would use these individuals to produce gold and silver. If you've had any type of history class, you know that Native Americans didn't do well at Jamestown. They didn't do well when they came into contact with European diseases. Many of them died. Some of them escaped, and escaped successfully because they knew the area, they knew the terrain. Not only that, but gold and silver weren't readily available. And because of this, Europeans had to kind of come up with another way to make their fortune, and they discovered tobacco, which as a trade item, they could bring, could really bring them a great deal of wealth. Growing tobacco, though, required a lot of labor. At this point, the colony this is when the colony began importing indentured servants because they needed this labor to produce tobacco. Mostly these people were arriving from England, and this is sort of the starting point to this idea or model of slavery. These settlers were being imported here and given a hope that they could acquire their own land if they worked long enough. If they could survive their period of servanthood, which could last anywhere from 5 to 7 years, then they were promised an opportunity to be set free and the opportunity to acquire land. It was around 1620 that the first Africans arrived. There are some historians that argue that colonists brought Africans to the New World as slaves. In other words, from the beginning, Europeans were naturally prejudiced towards Africans. There are other historians that hold that slavery didn't exist in the Englishmen's minds. They were unfamiliar with it, and instead they saw their society as a free one. They did, however, have forms of bond servitude. So this distinction between servanthood and slavery can really get blurred. So when the first Africans arrived in Jamestown, just like the European settlers, they were assimilated into the colony and considered a laborer and considered to be working under a contract. So it technically wasn't seen then as slavery, but more of a servanthood type of labor, where they came here under a contract and fulfilled that contract. Then they were allowed to acquire land and be set free. In fact, some Africans that were brought into the New World worked off their debts and they became freedmen. Anthony Johnson is one of the more historically documented cases of this. Johnson and his two sons owned about 440 acres of land and had many individuals working for them as servants. They had 3 Africans, 3 Europeans, 2 Native Americans. So I think this is a good picture of what I mean when I said that slavery, as we understand it today, didn't really exist in the Englishman minds. It wasn't connected to skin color or physical attributes at all. Andrew Johnson was allowed to exercise the same exact rights and opportunities as the colonist. He fulfilled his contract, and therefore he was allowed to have access to the same rights and the same opportunities as the colonist who brought him over here to begin with. Remember, during this time, there is still this idea of monogenesis, something we talked about in one of the first lectures. This is the idea that all humans descended from a single pair of ancestors. This means that Africans and Native Americans aren't seen as being any different from any other person. And here are some quotes that reflect this idea, and I'll just kind of go through and read them. From John Ogilvie in a book called Africa, written in 1670, says that Africans are very black, but the features of their faces, their excellent teeth being white as ivory, make up together a handsome eye, and taking comeliness of a new beauty. Indians are a sort of white men in America, as I am told, that only differ from us in having no beards. So you can kind of see how there's really nothing seen different between these two, what we would call races today, except the fact that one had beards, one did not. Another quote from book Journal of a Voyage Up the Gambia said the Africans are black as coal. Here, through custom, being Christians, in other words, they have embraced this cultural difference, they account themselves as white men. So you can see from these quotes sort of this the way things are around this time, that there's not this idea of slavery being connected to skin color in any way, and in fact they're often describing and seeing skin colors as not really a difference at all. There was no stigma associated with intermarriages. At this time, black men servants often married white women servants. And this is kind of also when things began to go into a crisis. It was becoming more and more difficult for the freedmen, the servants or the slaves, to acquire land because most of it was already owned by those few earlier settlers. There were a few wealthy men, but they were controlling a great deal of the land, which means that they also had a great deal of servants. And this led to Bacon's Rebellion of 1767. It was led by Nathaniel Bacon, and this rebellion is one of the many that threatened the colonial government. This led to a complete breakdown of law and order. Bond laborers joined in the rebellion, and in September of 1676, they burned Jamestown to the ground. And this is what I'm going to call this turning point of how servants were seen. Planters now had thousands of poor, working class men and women rebelling against them. This was likely the majority of the population and included both white and black individuals. The British sent an expedition in response to the rebellion, and freedom was promised to about 400 English and black bonded servants. I took this quote from a book, which is where the majority of this lecture was taken from, and I think it's relevant here because it reveals what I mean by this turning point. Why is this rebellion significant in history in terms of the history of the race concept? And Allen says that 128 years before William Lloyd Garrison was born, laboring class African Americans and European Americans fought side by side for the abolition of slavery. In so doing, they provided the supreme proof that the white race did not then exist. This is the time when the planters were recognizing that they needed some way to prevent this from occurring again, some way to have control over laborers. So during the last decades of the 17th century into the early 18th century, this is when the establishment of racial slavery began. Decisions and laws were being passed that restricted Africans and their descendants to any type of rights. This brought them into what we know today as permanent slavery. Now, Africans were being brought to America directly from Africa. The earlier Africans, remember, were being brought over from Europe, where they had already kind of become accustomed to a life of servanthood. But now Africans were seen as different from those earlier Africans because they weren't familiar with any type of European customs or traditions. Most historians argue that Africans were chosen over Native Americans because they were more immune to these old world diseases. And they also knew nothing about America, the landscape, the terrain. Native Americans, on the other hand, were really familiar with the land, and they would often escape to these familiar territories. Racial slavery was established throughout the 1700s, and by 1723, free blacks were no longer given voting rights. Leaders began to establish what we recognize today as racial identities. For instance, in 1691, we see the first public record of the use of the term, quote, white, being used instead of Christian, or another ethnic terminology like English or Irish being used. This law prohibited the marriage of Europeans with black, Native Americans, or mulattoes. Colony leaders were also passing laws that were allowing for freed European servants to buy land, and this was giving them more opportunities than before. There was this really clear division being created, and it was based upon physical features, and it was simply to avoid another rebellion of lower class working individuals. The colonists thought that by offering advantages to the freed European poor, then their opposition to official policies wouldn't be an issue. They were essentially trying to decrease the number of individuals in the working class so that a riot couldn't arise again. Colonists recognized physical differences, but it wasn't until the end of the 17th century that we see them imposing a social meaning to the physical differences. And this is the part of the historical story that most of us are familiar with. By the end of the 1860s, slavery ended. But there's a whole dichotomy of race ideology that's really just beginning at this point. At this period of time, it's no longer about skin color, but now it's about blood. Regardless of skin color, having a black ancestor made you black, or having one drop of Native American blood made you Native American. In other words, each race was seen as having physical traits that were inherited through the blood and therefore could be passed on to the children. It's also during this time that science is being used to confirm these differences. This is something that we discussed in detail a few lectures back. This is the period during the scientific literacy that body measurements, head and skull measurements, are being taken to try and prove a system of hierarchy. I just want to take a moment here and make sure that you're seeing what is actually occurring at this time. This is the time that quote, races in North America are being developed. It was the political elevation of this idea of separateness and difference that helped to bring about the social categories that we refer to as races today. Blumenbach was the first to create a race-based classification of humans and is really a major contributor to establishing a framework by which to assess differences between races. And by the end of the 19th century, it was believed that multiple species of humans existed. So we're now moving to this polygyny concept. Remember back to a few lectures ago, we talked about Samuel Morton and Agassiz. And these were two of the more prevalent scientists that were contributing to the polygyny thesis. Morton was one of the more influential individuals in the field of anthropology. Remember, he was the one using his own collection of hundreds of skulls from around the world to conduct experiments on the cranial capacity of humans and their intelligence, and connecting this to racial differences. This movement of scientists to explain racial differences and measure them so that they are associated with skin color led to the eugenics movement. Before, it was scientists measuring physical phenotypic traits and associating with them with skin color. But now, race is beginning to be something that was attributed to heredity or attributed to genes. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, eugenics is a prevalent movement. Francis Galton, an anthropologist, was the founder of this movement, and he states that eugenics, and I'm quoting here, eugenics will give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable. This was done through positive eugenics, where certain groups were encouraged to breed with one another. Or, on the other hand, there's also the concept of negative eugenics, where certain groups were denied the right to reproduce. This was done through sterilization in the U.S., and the most extreme case of this was in Nazi Germany through genocide. But Charles Davenport, a biologist, was the scientist who promoted these ideas in the U.S. He was the director of the Eugenics Records Office. And another quote I want to mention Davenport saying, he wrote, "We are driven to the conclusion that there is a constitutional, hereditary, genetical basis for the difference between the two races, black and white, in mental test. We have to conclude that there are racial differences in mental capacity." He, along with others, were influential in getting the Immigration Act of 1924 passed through Congress. This eugenics movement made race a permanent, unalterable genetic occurrence. Education, changes in climate or environment, nothing could alter race, and therefore it was seen as something that was purely influenced by genes alone. One of the most influential critics of the eugenics movement was W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was the founder of the NAACP. Sorry, we should have already moved to this slide. As I was saying, one of the most influential critics of the eugenics movement was Du Bois, and he was the founder of the NAACP. He was among the first to argue that race was a socially constructed phenomena. During the mid-20th century, so the 1930s to 1950s, the eugenics notions of fixed genetic differences was beginning to be rejected. Most biologists and population geneticists were beginning to assess human races from a population genetic approach. There was still this idea that there were a particular number of races, but that racial groupings were dependent upon which traits were being examined. Publications by geneticists like L.C. Dunn, Dobzhansky, anthropologists like Ruth Benedict, Ashley Montague, they were all arguing that race was more complex than we thought. Human heredity was even more complex. And by 1972, we get the most convincing genetic work on human variation. It becomes available. Richard Lewontin, who was a student of Dobzhansky's, published his genetic study and showed that human populations were more genetically diverse than we ever thought. And just like you saw in the film that you watched in the first portion of the course, in June of 2000, Francis Collins and Craig Venter announced the completion of a draft sequence of the human genome. Genomic data was offered to everyone in hopes of better understanding human biology and to better understand medical influences. And it's this work that showed that human genetic diversity is not that great. Humans are 99.9% genetically identical. Genetic diversity offers no explanation for the scientific basis of race. While this seems to be the end point of the lecture, I want to remind you that race, while it now has been shown to have no genetic basis, race still exists. As we have already discussed in previous lectures, race is a social construct, and we're going to really discuss what this means in the next lecture.